Okay, so we are going to go over solving equations using square roots. And so square roots are like the undoing of squaring a number. Okay, that's what it actually means. So the square of a number, the square of a number is that number multiplied by itself. That's the definition, right? Okay, and the square of an integer is what we call a perfect square. So go ahead and think about some perfect squares. Think about 2 squared and 4 squared and 3 squared. The square of -12 is written as -12 in parentheses squared. Ms. Johnson, why do you have to put it in parentheses? Well, if you didn't, the only thing that's being squared is the 12. Okay. The opposite of the square of 12 is written as -12 squared. So these two numbers here are not the same. I know they look the same, but they're not the same. Okay. And in fact, this number is positive, but this number is negative. So 2 times 2, another number that can be multiplied by itself, equal to 4 is what? So I want you to think about that. Since 2 times 2 is 4, I want you to think of another number that can be multiplied by itself to equal to 4. What is that other number? What's that other number? And hopefully you said the number -2. Very good. So then it says fill in the blanks, blah, blah, blah. Okay, a blank is a number that produces a given number when it's multiplied by itself. Okay, so that is the square root. Okay, a square root is a number that produces a given number when it's multiplied by itself. The blank is the positive square root of a number and is shown with the symbol of the square root, right? So we call this the principal square root, meaning it's the positive version of itself. Okay, so let's, fill out some stuff. So a number multiplied by itself blank times. So let's look at this. How many times are we multiplying? Oh, 3. So we're going to put 3 in here. We call this 1 cubed equals 1 times 1 times 1, which is equal to 1. 2 cubed is 2 times 2 times 2, which 2 times 2 is 4, times 2 is 8. Now they have 3 factors of 4 here, so we're going to go with 4 cubed is equal to 4 times 4, which is 16, right? Times 4 is 64. So when you're multiplying, you're really just multiplying 2 things at a time, okay? When you're multiplying, you're just multiplying 2 things at a time. Okay, so the next piece. What is a cube root? So this is how we write cube roots, right? This is how we write cube root. A cube root is the number that produces a given number when it's multiplied by itself 3 times. For example, 4 times 4 times 4. Use the radical to represent the cube root of 8. So go ahead and try writing the cube root of 8 for me. Go ahead and try writing the cube root of 8. Okay, very good. You should have written cube root of 8. And what is the cube root of -8? So the cube root of -8, you're thinking what times itself? Times itself gives me -8. So you're like, okay, let me try 1. So 1 times 1 times 1 doesn't give me -8. I'm like, oh, it's negative. So maybe we can try -1. And you try -1 times -1 times -1. Oh, that's -1. Closer, but not really. So then you try 2. And you say, oh, 2 times 2 times 2. Oh, that's 8. And you're like, oh, maybe I should try -2. So -2 times -2 is 4. Times -2, oh, that's -8. So therefore, it's -2. This says complete the steps in order to show x squared equals to 36. So the very first thing I want you to do when you're looking at this is I want you to take the square root. So take the square root of both sides. Now notice this plus or minus symbol in front of 36 is because it has two. See this little two guy? He's telling you, hey, I have two answers. And you're like, oh, you do? And you're like, yeah, I have two answers. So he has two answers because it's a root. You have two. You should be looking for a positive one and a negative one. Okay. So rewrite the two different equations. So x squared equals to 36 and x squared equals to negative 36. No, sorry, the square root of x squared equals to 36 and the square root of x squared equals to negative square root 36. These two undo each other. You guys would say something like, oh, it cancels it out, Miss Johnson. Yes, but we use the word inverse in math, right? So what is the square root of 36? And you're like, oh, that's 6. Good. What's the negative square root of 36? And you're like, oh, that's just negative 6, Miss Johnson. Exactly. Okay, it says each icon contains 1024 pixels arranged in rows. What does P represent in the equation P squared equals to 1024? So if you've ever looked at a TV screen, some of the TV screens still have what we call pixels. Okay, pixels. And they're just saying that P squared equals to 1024. P represents the number of pixels or dots. The number of pixels or dots in each row. What is the first step in solving here? Well, let's look back here. What did we do first? Oh, we took the square root. So we took the square root. So let's do that here. We take the square root, we take the square root. So we get P squared square root is equal to plus or minus the square root of 1024, 1024. All right. And so then you remember that you're going to write this out into two equations, a positive one and a negative one. Okay. Okay, and then so we have to figure out what the square root of 1024 is, and I'm just going to show you how to do that. If you use a regular calculator like this, it's right there, the square root. So these calculators work backwards, so you don't take the square root of 1024 when you type it in. You don't hit square root then 1024, you take the 1024 and then you hit square root. And it says the square root of 1024 is 32. So here we're going to write P equals 32 or negative 32. Now, in this problem, 32 makes sense. That's the number of pixels in each row. But negative 32 doesn't make sense because I can't have a negative answer for this. Okay, so and that's what this question is asking. So it says solving an equation in the form of x cubed is very similar. Okay, so instead of taking the square root, you're going to take the cube root. So instead of taking the square root, you're going to take the cube root. Okay, instead of having two solutions, you can have up to 3 solutions. But in your case, for right now, you guys will only have one solution. Later on in later maths, you'll see that you'll have 3 different solutions. Maybe up to maybe. And then that's pretty much it. Okay. So now you're going to figure out how to solve this step by step. So same thing goes. You're going to be taking the cube root here. Notice here, you are not going to put plus or minus because cube doesn't work like square does. When you square something and it's positive, it makes the answer positive. When you square something and it's negative, it makes the answer positive. It doesn't change that sign. So if you think about cubed, it doesn't work like that. Like a negative times a positive is a negative times a negative is a positive. But then times a negative again, it brings it back to its negative. Okay, so really, you do not need the plus or minus here. It is not necessary. I mean, if you put it, it's actually wrong. Okay. So what times itself gives you 125, and you're like, oh, that's got to be a number bigger than say 3 because you already tried 1 and 2. So you'll actually figure out that the answer is 5. Moving along. So it says the volume of a salt container is 125 centimeters cubed. What does X represent in this equation? X cubed equals to 125. X cubed equals to 125. And so X represents like the cube, like you please imagine that this salt container is a cube, right? So if this salt container is it's like a little brick of salt, maybe it's a box of salt, maybe. X represents the length of the side of the cube. What's the first step? You guys should know this now. You're going to cube root both sides. You already know this answer. X is equal to 5. Now here, question, are we including plus or minus? Are we including plus and minus? And hopefully you said, no, we're not, because this is a cube. So is X equals -5 a solution? And we just talked about that. The answer is no. So when you're taking the square root, or if you have an equation that has a cube root in it, and you're trying to find the solution, the first thing that you should definitely do is you should definitely find out if it has a plus or minus. I'll tell you right now, most of my students, when they make mistakes, is because they forget this plus or minus, because if you're not paying attention, it doesn't really necessarily have to appear. Does that make sense? It doesn't have to appear. Okay, so with that being said, math, this is my new phrase, right? Math may not always be easy, but it should make sense. Have a great day.